Good morning. So yesterday in our assignment, we looked at two different biographies of Jacques Cartier, and we were looking in there we were reading those biographies critically and looking for some information to see how those two biographies matched up, and then also see if there was some information that may not have jived well with one another, that might have been a little bit fishy. So what I thought we'd do is take a look at the one reading, because many of you identified one of those readings, the one that was all about explorers reading. We identified that one as being problematic. So let's go through that all about explorers reading together and identify some of the issues that we found inside of that reading. Okay, so let's take a look at this Cartier resource. This is the All About Explorers resource that we were looking at from our assignment yesterday. And I thought that we'd sort of read this together and look at it a little bit more in depth. And what I wanted to do was really have you think about what you're reading and read this information critically, okay? So let's read together and see if we can find anything that's sort of like looks a little fishy, doesn't sort of sit right with us about what's in this document. Jacques Cartier, this French-Canadian explorer, was born in 1492, coincidentally on the same day that Columbus left on his first voyage. So far, sounds good. He became known as a great navigator early in his career. He sailed with great explorers such as Henry Hudson, Lewis and Clark, and John Glenn, guiding them on their journeys. Okay, so here's where we get to our first instance of something maybe not being right, but it also depends on what your background knowledge is and what information you already know. He came to be known as a great navigator, sounds good, right? We know that he sailed up the St. Lawrence River. It's something we learned before. He sailed with great explorers such as Henry Hudson. Let's go ahead and I'm going to highlight this part. Henry Hudson, Lewis and Clark, and John Glenn. And this is where things start to get problematic, because Henry Hudson lived much later than Jacques Cartier. Same with Lewis and Clark, who were Americans who traveled through the western part of the United States in the 1800s, and John Glenn was an astronaut. So there's definitely something fishy about what's going on here. It wasn't until April of 1534 that King Francis of France funded his first solo expedition. Like his mentor Hudson, Cartier wanted to find a northwest passage to India and the Spice Islands. Though his motivation was different, Cartier's family was the premier watch manufacturer of Europe, and he was looking for new places to trade. So when we get to that last sentence, that seems to again to be very fishy to me. Cartier's family was the premier watch manufacturer of Europe. Now, I'm just going to take a guess here and guess that there weren't such things as watches in the 1500s, right? I don't know that for sure when things were invented, but they were manufacturing watches. There was no such thing as manufacturing back then. And by manufacturing, we mean producing a large number of goods in a short amount of time so that you can sort of reproduce that good over and over like an assembly line, right? That didn't exist. There was no such thing. Any goods that were made were handmade during that time. So saying that he was the premier watch manufacturer of Europe seems fishy to me. On his first voyage in 1534, Cartier sailed westward from France across the Arctic Ocean. Now we know that the Arctic Ocean is not in between France and North America. It was during this journey that he named the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He returned to France dejected, though, because he had been unable to sell any watches. There's our watches again. That seems fishy. His family was very disturbed and wanted him to set out again. So on May 19th, 1535, on his 44th birthday, And I don't know, we'd have to do some math there to see if those numbers match up. It sounds like they do, though. He took 3 ships back across the Arctic again there. And then we come to his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Now again, this depends on our background knowledge, but if we know anything about explorers, if we learned about the explorers in the past, we might know that Christopher Columbus sailed the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Those were not Cartier's ships, they were Columbus's ships. The third of these ships was completely stocked with hundreds of top quality watches, again with the watches, right, to sail to the locals. Who were the locals that he'd be selling these watches to? Native Americans? What use do they have for wristwatches, right? So this all seems kind of fishy to us. But the following year, he returned to France with every watch still on board. Cartier's family was understandably distraught, and they refused to finance his third expedition to the New World. He was determined to succeed, though, and less than 3 months later, he boarded a single ship, which was once more full of watches. Because the family had rejected him, though, Cartier was forced to bring cheap imitation watches that he had imported from Korea. Korea didn't even exist in the 1500s. When he arrived in Canada, his ship foundered on the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is not on the coast of Canada. That had frustrated Hudson so many times, and Cartier was forced to abandon his cargo except for his cloak and a few watches he was able to gather and keep wrapped in it. Over the next 2 years, Cartier traveled on foot from town to town, eventually ending up in New York City. New York City would not exist until many, many years later. Homeless and destitute, he was forced to live on the street, selling his imitation watches to whoever was willing to buy them. Cartier died penniless and was buried in an anonymous grave in Central Park. Again, Central Park does not exist, just behind the buffalo pen in the zoo, which also did not exist. Now, when we come back through here and we look at these things that we've highlighted, we've come up with a number of details here that are just fishy or downright false, right? And this is one of the things that we have to be careful of when using online resources, is that we don't use false information.